Hello and welcome to the Polyhistor podcast. I'm your host Nai, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion on the avant-garde movement in Russia after the Russian Civil War, and we're going to be talking about Alexander Rodchenko, as I promised. Now we're just going to jump right in. If you didn't listen to the previous episode about Varavara Stepanova, I would highly recommend it because that's going to kind of explain a lot of the background for the arts world and, talks about her, and I just think she's a really interesting figure in both art and history. So let's jump right in. Alexander Rodchenko was born on the 5th of December 1891. He was born in St. Petersburg to a working class family, and as we talked about with Vara Stepanova, in 1910 he attended the Kazan Art School. Now I don't want to talk about this too much because I kind of talked a lot about it with Stepanova, but all you need to know about his tutelage there was he was under the study of figures such as Nikolai Fichin and Georgy Medvedev. He continued his artistic training after his 4 years of study at the Stroganov Institute in Moscow, and this is where he started to begin to paint abstract artworks. Now, he was heavily inspired by a figure, Kazimir Malevich, who would actually go on to become his mentor. And what was interesting about their relationship was that while Rodchenko took a lot of inspiration from Malevich's work, if you don't remember who Malevich was from the Stepanova episode, he was the guy who was really into suprematism, which is all about drawing art using very geometric shapes and only geometric shapes. And that was what Malevich really enjoyed about mentoring Rodchenko, was that Rodchenko took the idea of these rudimentary shapes to create art to what you could argue was its logical conclusion. So what's interesting about how Rodchenko painted, he did not use brushes. He used compasses and rulers to get perfectly straight lines for his art. So yeah, it's a little bit different from the norm. So we're going to have to jump ahead. After the revolution has concluded and the Bolsheviks have seized power, Rodchenko is lucky enough to be put in the position of the director of the Museum Bureau and Purchasing Fund, which was responsible for the reorganization of museums and art schools after the revolution. The revolution, unsurprisingly, was very chaotic, and there was a lot of work put to try and reorganize art. And this is where I talk about a very big elephant in the room, Lenin. How did Lenin feel about art? Because obviously he and the Central Committee, the people that were running the Soviet Union, had a lot of sway. They were basically deciding what was going to be the future of culture for the Soviet Union. Now, Lenin described himself as an old man and did recognize that these very avant-garde, out there designs were a little bit beyond what he was used to. However, it's generally seen that he supported these arts and wanted to see them grow. There was a lot of push for them to be focused on working class and communist ideals, but generally speaking, he and the Central Committee were happy with what the constructivists created for now. We're going to get into that a little bit later. So after this, he was moved to become the secretary of the Moscow Artists Union, and he set up the Fine Arts Division of the People's Commissariat for Education, which would go on to create the Institute for Artistic Culture. I'm saying all this not because these terms need to really jump out at you and make you go, wow. I'm just trying to kind of paint a picture of how influential this guy was from a political standpoint. And I think it's easy to forget how important arts are, especially when you are trying to create a completely new political image, as the Bolsheviks were at the inception of the 20s. So, between 1920 and 1930, he was also in charge of the Higher Technical Artistic Studios, or Vektumas or Vektien, which was similar to the Bauhaus in Germany. Now, I could go on about the Bauhaus. Suffice to say, the Bauhaus was very similar to this. They were both avant-garde art schools that were unfortunately shut down really close to the same time. The Higher Technical Artistic Studio was shut down in 1930 by the Soviet government, which by that point was being led by Stalin. And in the case of the Bauhaus, it was shut down in 1933 by the Nazi Party, which had just seized power. But I want to talk about the good stuff because I think this is a really interesting part of both his life and the life of constructivism and the avant-garde in Soviet Russia. The concept behind Victimus, I apologize, I keep buggering up that word, but I'm just going to push ahead, was to create people with high qualifications in things like industry, building, managerial roles. And what's really fascinating about it is you could almost say it's closer to something you'd see for an engineering course than it would be for art. It had a wealth of facilities ranging from metalworking, ceramics, textiles, printing, woodworking, sculpture, architecture, graphics. Its whole ideal was built around the three major avant-garde movements within Russia at that time: constructivism, suprematism, and rationalism. You don't need to know too much about rationalism. I've already talked about like 4 or 5 different avant-garde movements. Just understand that rationalism exists. I may do something about them in the future. Boy, I keep promising to do all these extra episodes on the arts movements, and oh god, someone's going to remember all that and make me deliver one day. Anyway, moving forward. Big part of it, again, bearing in mind that Rodchenko was in charge of this facility, was about geometry and the emphasis on space. And it is considered one of the most revolutionary aspects of art history, not just art history in Russia. So how did it go about teaching students about constructivism and suprematism? Well, it was mainly interested in trying to communicate the value of art to a person's life. And as I said when we talked about Stepanova, Rodchenko was the same. He wanted to create art that would benefit people's everyday life. Now, he hadn't gone to his zenith, shall we say, and we're going to get to that soon. But there were lots of aspects of his courses and curriculum that you could see. So, for example, one of the things that he was very big on doing was creating pieces of furniture or pieces of machinery that could be used either in the home or in a factory. And it was very much about trying to create a means for people to use the facilities around them. Now, fun fact, I may have only briefly mentioned this, but Stepanova was also there, and this is where she really started her whole textiles industry. So, as I said, go back and listen to the episode to learn how that went. Now, unfortunately, the reason why this school closed down was for a similar reason that I mentioned in the Stepanova video, which is, unfortunately, they didn't really produce results. While yes, they were pottering around and tinkering with all these fun ideas to give people a freedom in their everyday life, it never really amounted to anything. Now, you could make the argument because many of these were students, and it was very difficult enough being a student trying to gain a foothold in a new market, let alone a new market that is completely been upended by a very large and very scary revolution that's only just ended. But also, it was just the practicality of it. As I talked about in the Stepanova video, it's very difficult to completely retrofit an entire industrial base to serve a completely new industrial idea. And unfortunately, the Central Committee were not really interested in doing that. However, as I said, while the school is very important and very interesting, but that is not the zenith of his career, because, as you see, Rodchenko ended painting. I know, all of you out there painters who have been painting, you don't know that in 1922, at the 5x5 = 25 exhibition, Rodchenko killed painting. Just iced it. Apparently you're not painting anymore. I'm being slightly facetious, but that was actually his title, The End of Painting. You see, he created a piece of work, what is considered to be the first true monochrome paintings, which was, as you can see on the screen here, 3 blocks of colour. Now, this is where I kind of want to talk about both their kind of ideals artistically and how big a deal these two people were for Russia at the time. You have to understand that with the complete upending of the status quo, for many Soviet peoples, it really did seem like what Rodchenko and Stepanova were proposing was a very real possibility. What he offered was a utopian possibility, this idea that art would fundamentally influence the way we lived our lives. And it was very optimistic and very powerful, but as we've seen, not very practical. And I think what is perhaps more interesting is when you hear what he says. And this is his direct quote about painting, the end of painting. "I reduced painting to its logical conclusion and exhibited 3 canvases, red, blue and yellow. I affirmed, it's all over." I kind of love that very ballsy statement, no, I have ended art, motherfuckers. Painting is done. Now, it is also at this time that he renounces painting. He puts all of his effort, similar to his eventual wife, Stepanova, into a completely new art form that he's only really dabbled in a little bit, in this case, graphic design. And this is kind of the thing that most people know him for. He was a graphic designer for things like posters, books, and films. And one filmmaker that very much touched his heart was Dazinga Vertov. He was a very important and very influential filmmaker in the 20s and early 30s of the Soviet Union, and he was very influential in creating Soviet films that the general public would enjoy. Films, and again I'm going on a slight tangent here, were considered a very essential part to the Soviet Union and were believed to be one of the main means that the Soviet Union could encourage communism within its own people and encourage faith in the state and things like that. Something that would be used to great effect during the Stalinist regime, both before, during and after the Second World War. A big influence on Rodchenko's graphic design was German Dadaists. And oh god, do I want to talk about Dadaists, because they're properly out there. If you think every type of weird avant-garde art movement is bizarre, Dadaists on a whole nother plane. Basically, Dadaism's shtick, if you will, is that they wanted to reduce everything to, I don't want to say incoherency, but basically it was a reaction to the great suffering and utter bemusement of the function of the First World War. Why had so many young lives been sacrificed for what seemed something so meaningless? And Dadaism was kind of a reaction to that, what was meaning. And it was all about rendering everything, and I do mean everything, meaningless. It's not nihilism per se, because it was more whimsical and ridiculous than that. As I said, I do want to cover Dadaism. But anyway, he was very interested in something that Dadaists had kind of pioneered, which is a photo montage, kind of like a collage, like when you make lots of little photos on top of each other to make a larger image. That's kind of what he was interested in, and he began experimenting in the early 20s. Now, one of his first major graphical design works was for the Mayakovsky's poem About This in 1923. He would then go on to make what is considered his most famous poster, and something I would assume, if you've not ever seen it, you've probably seen something that's aping it, so to speak, which is sometimes titled, although not always, Books. And here it is for you to see, and I do actually have the translation for this, is Books in All Branches of Knowledge. And the typeface, as you can see, is quite modernist for the time. Now, he would continue to work with the poet Mayakovsky, and the pair of them, along with Stepanova and many other constructivists, would work on LEF, which we talked about with the Stepanova one, which was, I don't think I mentioned this at the time listening back, was very much the constructivists magazine. If you want to see constructivist work, that's what you picked up, LEF. And he was very instrumental in really showing off the potential of constructivism with his photography, using it for the cover of that magazine and other journals and the like. Now, to describe his artistic style within the photography, it was all about removing the unnecessary detail and emphasizing dynamism, and it was all about how the object was placed. And this would become very well known when he would start to cover things like sporting events. So it was about showing the athlete and only the athlete in this sense of movement, perhaps a long jumper jumping, and that's all you would see, that kind of the physical form moving through the air. And that's kind of a good summation of his artistic career. Now, he and Stepanova would also be known for the panels of the Mosul Prom building in Moscow. And Yeah, I think I've covered a good part of his career, so let's cover the bad part, because, hey, we had to talk about the sad reality of Stepanova's dreams, so let's talk about his. So, as we said, there was a turn away from all these avant-garde movements to social realism, and I promised I would talk about social realism. So, social realism in simplistic terms is the artistic movement that you're most familiar with when you think of the Soviet Union. Fundamentally, its purpose is to promote the Soviet Union and communism. And it's a rather deceptive term because social realism is often what we would call propaganda. It's not really realistic. When it shows workers achieving the goals of communism and celebrating the fruits of its labour, it's not always accurate, especially considering the numerous famines that did occur under the watchful eye of the Central Committee. However, it was, as I said, very useful for propaganda, and for the Stalinist regime, a lot better than these kind of going nowhere constructivist concepts. Now, unfortunately, Rodchenko was kicked from the October group of artists in 1928, basically because of what they called formalism. And what's shocking, well, I think it's shocking, maybe you won't, is that similar to Stepanova, he never abandons the party. He never really got upset or rebelled or really seemed to get angry at them. I mean, sure, he probably was personally wounded pride-wise, but he continued to support the communist regime. He would produce throughout the late 30s and 40s many pieces of parades, as I talked about, sporting events and choreographed movements, which was a strong point for him because his photography really did lend to showing off the prowess of those athletes. He did, coming near the end of his life and definitely near the end of his career, return to painting and got back into that expressionist, abstract style that he was once known for. And hell, I mean, there's not much more I can say about this guy. He really did stick to his guns and continue to support the regime right up to his death in 1956. And whether you think the communist regime was the best thing on earth ever or the absolute worst of the worst, I think it's kind of amazing that this guy believed in that so vehemently, as did both of them. And I wanted to end this with a quote from his, and I think this is perhaps the best way I could describe him is by reading this quote. One has to take several different shots of a subject from different points of view and in different situations, as if one examined it in the round rather than looked through the same keyhole again and again. Thank you for listening. This has been a lot of fun recording this. It's been kind of a bit of a stressful week, and this is probably a lower quality than I was hoping, but I really did enjoy making this, and I hope you enjoyed too. I am probably going to take a little break from arts movements because I've done 2 weeks of it now, and while I do love it, I don't want to stick to one thing for too long. So we'll see what next week brings, and as always, I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, and goodbye. Ta-da!